The phone buzzed against my desk at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, and I almost ignored it. Another sales call, probably. But Mrs. Patterson's panicked voice cut through the office noise like a knife through silence. "Your mother just collapsed in the front yard, Brady. The ambulance is on its way." Those words hit me harder than any punch I had ever taken. Just 3 hours earlier, I had stormed out of that same front yard after the most devastating argument of my life. My mother Janet had screamed at me with pure hatred in her eyes, words that still echoed in my head like broken glass. "I wish you were never born." My response had been equally cruel and final. "Consider me dead." Now racing through Denver traffic toward Presbyterian Medical Center, I could not shake the terrible thought that my moment of defiance might have literally killed her. The barbecue had started like any other family gathering at my childhood home in Lakewood. I pulled up to the familiar split-level house on Maple Street, seeing cars already filling the driveway and spilling onto the grass. My cousin Sarah was celebrating her engagement to Marcus, a software engineer from Boulder, and the whole extended family had gathered for the occasion. Uncle Frank was manning the grill with his usual precision, wearing his favorite apron that read, "World's Greatest Contractor." Aunt Martha bustled around the patio tables arranging potato salad and coleslaw with the organizational skills that made her such a respected elementary school principal. My cousin Tyler stood near the fence, animated as always, while describing his latest surgical procedure to anyone within earshot. At 32, Tyler had everything I supposedly lacked. Medical degree from University of Colorado mansion in Cherry Hills, luxury sedan that cost more than my annual salary. The golden child who never disappointed anyone. But the real star of the afternoon was Roger Blackstone, my mother's new boyfriend of 8 months. At 62, Roger carried himself with the confidence that came from a successful career in real estate development. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his polo shirt pressed without a single wrinkle, and his smile revealed teeth so white they practically glowed. He had charm in abundance, the kind that made everyone feel like the most important person in the room. I grabbed a beer from the cooler and tried to blend into the background, but Roger spotted me immediately. "Brady, my man, how's the marketing world treating you these days?" His handshake was firm, commanding the grip of someone accustomed to closing deals and taking control. "I work in digital marketing for a non-profit downtown," I explained, but his eyes had already glazed over with polite disinterest. The conversation shifted when my mother emerged from the house practically glowing with excitement. She wore a sundress I had never seen before, her hair styled in a way that took years off her appearance. The transformation was remarkable. At 58, Janet had spent the past 3 years grieving my father's death from cancer, barely leaving the house except for groceries and doctor visits. Seeing her animated and happy should have made me grateful. Instead, I felt uneasy as she positioned herself next to Roger, their body language suggesting an intimacy that seemed rushed for an 8-month relationship. Roger wrapped his arm around her waist with possessive familiarity, and she leaned into him like he was her anchor in rough seas. "Everyone," Janet announced, her voice carrying across the patio with unusual confidence. "Roger has something wonderful to share." The family gathered closer, sensing an important moment approaching. Roger cleared his throat and reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box that caught the afternoon sunlight. "Janet Elizabeth Morrison," Roger said with practiced smoothness. "You have brought joy back into my life when I thought happiness was impossible. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal was perfectly executed, complete with Roger dropping to one knee on the freshly cut grass, while Janet covered her mouth in apparent surprise. The family erupted in celebration. Aunt Martha actually squealed with delight. Uncle Frank clapped Roger on the back with genuine enthusiasm. Cousin Sarah hugged my mother with tears in her eyes, gushing about how romantic the whole thing was. Tyler raised his beer in a toast to the happy couple. I stood frozen watching the scene unfold with growing alarm. 8 months wasn't long enough to really know someone, especially after the kind of devastating loss my mother had experienced. Dad had been her whole world for 35 years. She had never even dated anyone else before him. The speed of this relationship felt dangerous, reckless even. Roger slipped the engagement ring onto my mother's finger with theatrical flourish. The diamond was enormous, easily 3 carats, surrounded by smaller stones that sparkled like captured stars. "This must have cost a fortune," Aunt Martha whispered admiringly. Roger just smiled with the confidence of someone for whom money was never an issue. During dinner, Roger dominated the conversation with stories about his business successes, his travels through Europe, his plans for renovating my mother's house. He spoke about her life like he was already in charge of it, mentioning improvements to the kitchen updates, to the landscaping, even suggestions about her friendships. "Some of those old bridge club ladies are pretty negative influences," Roger said, while cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Janet needs to surround herself with more positive energy people who support her growth and happiness." My mother nodded along, agreeing with his assessment of friends she had known for decades. The conversation turned to family achievements with Uncle Frank, bragging about Tyler's latest promotion to chief of surgery. Tyler accepted the praise with false modesty, launching into detailed descriptions of complex procedures and life-saving operations. Then Roger turned his attention to me with what seemed like genuine interest. "And Brady, what about your career plans? Are you thinking about advancing beyond nonprofit work?" The question sounded innocent enough, but his tone carried subtle condescension. "Nonprofit marketing is important work," I replied carefully. "We help connect people with resources they desperately need." Roger nodded with the patronizing smile of someone humoring a child's unrealistic dreams. "But surely you want something more substantial, eventually. Property investment, business ownership, building real wealth for your future family?" His gaze swept my modest outfit, my 10-year-old Honda parked behind his luxury Mercedes. "Brady has always been content with simple things," my mother interjected, but her tone suggested disappointment rather than pride. "He rents a small apartment downtown, works for causes instead of profit." Very idealistic. The word idealistic dripped with the same disdain she might use to describe someone who believed in fairy tales. I felt my face burning with embarrassment as the family absorbed this assessment of my supposedly inadequate life choices. Roger sensed the opportunity to drive his point home deeper. "There's nothing wrong with helping people, Brady, but you also need to think about helping yourself. Building security, establishing your place in the world. Otherwise, you might end up being more of a burden than a blessing to the people who love you." The words hit me like a physical blow. A burden. That is how they saw me. The idealistic son who had disappointed everyone by choosing meaning over money, service over status. I excused myself and walked into the house needing space to process what had just happened. I found myself in the kitchen staring at family photos on the refrigerator. Pictures of Dad and me fishing at Cherry Creek Reservoir. Images from my college graduation where both parents beamed with pride. Memories of when my choices were celebrated instead of criticized. My mother followed me inside her expression, a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. "Brady, you're being rude to Roger. He's trying to help you, to encourage you towards something better." Her loyalty to this man she barely knew felt like another betrayal. "Mom?" I said quietly. "Don't you think things are moving too fast? 8 months ago you couldn't even leave the house. Now you're engaged to someone whose background you know almost nothing about. This doesn't feel like you making these decisions." Her face transformed with sudden fury. "How dare you question my choices? For 3 years I was buried alive with grief, and Roger brought me back to life. He sees value in me that my own son apparently cannot." Maybe if you showed half the support and encouragement that Roger does, you would understand what real love looks like. I tried to stay calm, but her words were hitting every insecurity I had carried for years. Mom, I just want you to be careful. Dad's life insurance and the house represent your entire security. Moving too fast with major decisions could put everything at risk. You deserve someone who loves you for yourself, not your assets. That was apparently the wrong thing to say. My mother's eyes blazed with absolute rage, her voice rising to a shout that could probably be heard outside. You have never supported my happiness, never encouraged my dreams or celebrated my successes. All you do is worry and criticize and hold me back from living my life. You're selfish, Brady. You're jealous that I found love again because it means I don't need to worry about taking care of you anymore. Her words escalated beyond anything we had ever said to each other, beyond the boundaries of normal family arguments. Roger treats me like a queen. She continued, her voice breaking with emotion. He values my opinions, supports my goals, makes me feel beautiful and desired. You make me feel like a burden, like someone who needs constant protection from her own choices. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like without the constant weight of disappointing my own child. Then came the words that would haunt me forever. Her face was twisted with genuine hatred, her voice filled with venom I had never heard before. I wish you were never born. The silence that followed felt like the world had stopped spinning. Every childhood memory, every moment of love and connection seemed to crumble in the space between us. My response came from a place of pure hurt, designed to wound her as deeply as she had wounded me. Fine, I said, with ice-cold finality. Consider me dead. I walked past her toward the front door, my vision blurred with tears and rage. The family was still on the patio laughing at some joke Roger had told, completely unaware that everything had just exploded inside the house. I climbed into my Honda without looking back, my hands shaking as I started the engine. Through the rearview mirror, as I pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of my mother stumbling out the front door. She was clutching her chest with both hands, her face contorted in what looked like pain or panic. Roger and Uncle Frank rushed toward her as she collapsed onto the grass, but I was already turning the corner, driving away from what would become the worst moment of both our lives. Presbyterian Medical Center's emergency waiting room felt like a tomb when I arrived 20 minutes after Mrs. Patterson's call. The fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh shadows, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with fear created an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. My family clustered together near the reception desk, like survivors of some terrible accident, which in many ways they were. Uncle Frank spotted me first, his face immediately hardening with accusation and rage. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his contractor's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You selfish piece of garbage," he snarled loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your mother is fighting for her life because of what you said to her. How does it feel to know you might have killed the woman who gave birth to you?" Aunt Martha was sobbing into tissues, her usual composure completely shattered. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Brady, how could you be so cruel to her? She loves you more than anything in the world, and you threw those horrible words at her like weapons." The disappointment in her tone was almost worse than Uncle Frank's anger. Cousin Sarah sat in a plastic chair with Marcus's arm around her shoulders, staring at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into their private tragedy. "We canceled the engagement party," she said flatly. "Everyone was too upset to continue celebrating after what happened. Thanks for ruining what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life." Even Tyler, who usually stayed above family drama, shook his head with professional disapproval. "Brady, as a doctor, I've seen what emotional trauma can do to the cardiovascular system. Stress-related strokes are very real, and they can be triggered by exactly the kind of confrontation you initiated with Mom." But Roger emerged as the family's unofficial spokesman, positioning himself as the devoted protector who had tried to shield my mother from her ungrateful son's cruelty. He wore grief like a perfectly tailored suit, every expression and gesture calculated for maximum sympathy. "Brady," he said with manufactured sadness, "Janet spoke about you constantly worried about your future, your happiness, your success. She sacrificed so much trying to help you become the man she knew you could be. And this is how you repaid her love." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison appeared from behind the double doors marked Authorized Personnel. Only her scrubs still bearing traces of the emergency room's organized chaos. The family surrounded her immediately, desperate for information about my mother's condition. Dr. Morrison's expression was professionally neutral, but I could see the concern in her eyes. "Mrs. Morrison suffered a significant cerebrovascular accident, commonly called a stroke," she explained in the careful language doctors use to deliver devastating news. "The blockage occurred in the middle cerebral artery, affecting speech and motor function on the left side of her body. We've administered clot-dissolving medication, but the next 72 hours will be critical in determining the extent of permanent damage." Uncle Frank interrupted with the question everyone was thinking. "Doctor, could emotional stress have caused this to happen?" Dr. Morrison hesitated before answering, choosing her words carefully. "Acute emotional trauma can certainly be a contributing factor in cardiovascular events, especially in patients with underlying risk factors like hypertension or diabetes. However, strokes typically result from multiple complex factors rather than single incidents. The medical explanation did nothing to reduce the family's conviction that I was directly responsible for my mother's condition. Roger asked about visiting arrangements, and Dr. Morrison explained that only immediate family members would be allowed during the critical care period. As the next of kin and primary decision-maker, I should have been the one making medical choices for my mother. Instead, I discovered that Roger had somehow been granted medical power of attorney just 2 weeks earlier. He produced the legal documents from his briefcase, with efficient preparation showing my family and the medical staff that my mother had officially designated him to make healthcare decisions on her behalf. The paperwork looked legitimate, bearing my mother's signature and proper notarization. Dr. Morrison accepted the documents without question, explaining visiting restrictions and treatment options to Roger, while I stood there feeling completely powerless. Roger immediately imposed additional limitations beyond what the hospital required, claiming that my presence might cause my mother stress that could worsen her condition. He restricted my visits to 30 minutes twice per day, and only when he or another family member was present to supervise. I tried to object, but Uncle Frank supported Roger's restrictions completely. "You've done enough damage, Brady. The least you can do is respect the wishes of the man who actually loves and protects your mother." Aunt Martha nodded agreement through her tears, while Tyler and Sarah exchanged glances that clearly communicated their support for keeping me away from my own mother's bedside. The waiting room felt suffocating as I realized how completely I had been isolated from my family's support system. 3 hours earlier, I had been their son, nephew, and cousin. Now I was the villain who had caused this entire tragedy through my selfishness and cruelty. The transformation was so complete it felt like stepping into an alternate reality. I found myself wandering the hospital corridors, unable to leave, but unwelcome in my mother's room. Near the elevators, I encountered Lisa Chen, a social worker who specialized in patient advocacy and family support services. She was a small woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the practiced calm that came from handling medical crises every day. Lisa noticed my distress and gently asked if I needed someone to talk with about my mother's condition. I explained the family situation, the restricted visiting hours, and my concerns about Roger's sudden authority over my mother's care. Lisa listened carefully, her expression growing more focused as I described the timeline of events. "I see situations like this more often than you might think," Lisa said quietly. When elderly patients become incapacitated, family dynamics can become quite complicated, especially when new relationships are involved. However, properly executed power of attorney documents must be respected unless there are clear legal grounds for challenging them. She paused, studying my face with the assessment skills that made her effective at her job. That said, if you have concerns about undue influence or elder abuse, there are resources available for investigation. But you would need concrete evidence of coercion or fraud, not just suspicions based on timing or family conflict. Lisa gave me her business card and encouraged me to document any unusual observations about my mother's care or Roger's behavior. She also mentioned that the hospital had protocols for addressing potential elder abuse situations, but they required substantial proof before taking action that could override legal documents. Walking back toward the intensive care unit, I passed my mother's room and glimpsed her through the small window. She lay connected to monitors and IV lines, her face pale against the white pillows, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. Roger sat beside the bed, holding her hand, playing the role of devoted partner with theatrical perfection. I stood in the hallway feeling completely helpless, watching this man control access to my own mother, while my family treated me like a dangerous intruder. The guilt over our argument was crushing enough, without adding the isolation and blame from everyone I had grown up loving and trusting. As visiting hours ended, and the family prepared to leave, I overheard Roger speaking quietly on his cell phone near the hospital parking garage. I was too far away to hear specific words, but his tone was different from the grief-stricken performance he maintained around the family. More businesslike, more calculating, as if he was discussing strategy rather than expressing concern for a loved one's health. That brief glimpse of Roger's private conversation planted the first seeds of suspicion that would eventually grow into a desperate investigation. If my mother's stroke was somehow connected to more than just our argument, if there were other factors at play that the family couldn't see, then maybe I wasn't the monster they believed me to be. Maybe the real threat to my mother's safety was still lurking in plain sight, hiding behind expressions of love and concern. Taking emergency leave from my marketing job felt like admitting defeat, but I could not focus on non-profit fundraising campaigns while my mother lay unconscious and my family treated me like a pariah. My supervisor, Jennifer, was understanding, offering the company's employee assistance program and flexible return options whenever I was ready to resume normal life. Normal life felt like a luxury I might never experience again. Mrs. Patterson lived in the blue house directly across from my childhood home, and she had been watching our family's activities for over 15 years with the dedication of an amateur surveillance expert. She invited me onto her sun porch for coffee and homemade cookies, treating me with the kindness I was not receiving anywhere else. "Brady, honey," Mrs. Patterson said, while pouring coffee from a floral ceramic pot. "I've been wanting to talk with you about some things I've noticed lately. Your mother has been acting differently since Roger came into her life, and not necessarily in good ways." She paused to arrange cookies on a plate, choosing her words carefully. "Roger started coming around last spring," Mrs. Patterson continued, "and at first it seemed wonderful. Your poor mother had been so isolated after your father's passing. But gradually things began changing in ways that concerned me. He began accompanying her to the mailbox every day, sorting through her letters and packages, like he had some official right to manage her correspondence. This was news to me. My mother had always been fiercely independent about her personal business, handling her own finances and legal matters without assistance from anyone. The idea of Roger controlling her mail seemed completely out of character for the woman who had raised me to value self-sufficiency above almost everything else. Mrs. Patterson retrieved a small notebook from her kitchen drawer, flipping through pages of handwritten observations, with dates and times meticulously recorded. "Here," she said, pointing to entries from June and July. Roger's car was parked in your mother's driveway from morning until night 7 days a week. Janet stopped attending her bridge club meetings, even though she had never missed Tuesday games for over 10 years. Her closest friends called me asking if she was ill or upset about something. The bridge club detail hit me particularly hard because those women had been my mother's support system throughout Dad's illness and death. Mary Henderson, Dorothy Walsh, and Susan Martinez had been like sisters to her, providing emotional support and practical help during the darkest months of her grief. For Roger to isolate her from those friendships suggested a level of control that went far beyond normal romantic involvement. I also noticed Roger going through Janet's garbage bins on collection days. Mrs. Patterson added her voice, dropping to a whisper, as if we were discussing state secrets. He would sort through papers and documents, sometimes taking items back into the house. When I asked Janet about it casually, she claimed Roger was helping her organize important files and dispose of outdated paperwork properly. These observations painted a picture of systematic control that made my stomach turn with anxiety. Mrs. Patterson suggested I speak with David Coleman, my mother's longtime financial advisor, who had been managing her retirement accounts and insurance policies since Dad's death 3 years earlier. David's office was located in a professional building downtown, and he agreed to meet with me that same afternoon, despite his busy schedule. At 65, David had been handling financial planning for families like ours for over 30 years, building relationships based on trust and personal attention, rather than high-pressure sales tactics. Brady David said after we settled in his office overlooking the Denver skyline, "I've been hoping someone from your family would contact me about some unusual activity in your mother's accounts. Over the past 3 months, Janet has made several large withdrawals and investment changes that concern me from both financial and personal perspectives." He opened a thick file folder containing statements and transaction records spanning the previous 6 months. The pattern was immediately obvious and deeply troubling. Starting in late June, my mother had begun making substantial cash withdrawals, depleting her savings account by nearly $40,000. She had also liquidated 2 certificates of deposit worth another $60,000, paying early withdrawal penalties that cost her thousands in lost interest. Most concerning, David explained, were changes to beneficiary designations on her life insurance policies and retirement accounts. Just 3 weeks ago, Janet came in with Roger and updated all her beneficiaries, removing you and other family members, while designating Roger as the primary recipient of approximately $800,000 in combined benefits. The financial implications were staggering, but the timeline was even more disturbing. These changes had occurred just days before the barbecue confrontation that led to my mother's stroke. If she had died from the stroke, Roger would have inherited the vast majority of her assets while the family was too grief-stricken and guilt-ridden to ask difficult questions about timing or circumstances. David pulled out additional paperwork showing recent changes to my mother's checking account, with Roger's name added as a joint account holder with full access to all funds. He had also been designated as a signatory on her house deed, effectively making him a co-owner of the property where my father had lived and worked for 35 years. I asked David if these changes seemed consistent with my mother's previous financial behavior and decision-making patterns. He shook his head emphatically, explaining that throughout their 10-year professional relationship, my mother had been extremely conservative and methodical about any financial decisions, always taking time to research options and discuss major changes with family members before proceeding. These recent transactions were completed quickly, often with Roger present during meetings, and your mother seemed anxious or distracted rather than confident about her choices, David revealed. She signed documents without her usual careful review, and when I asked questions about her reasoning, Roger answered for her more often than she answered for herself. David also mentioned that Roger had been asking detailed questions about my mother's financial portfolio, her estate planning documents, and the timeline for processing insurance claims in case of death or incapacitation. These inquiries went far beyond normal curiosity about a partner's financial security, suggesting someone gathering information for ulterior purposes. I left David's office feeling sick with the realization that my mother's stroke might be connected to a much larger and more sinister situation than family conflict over harsh words. If Roger had been systematically isolating her, controlling her finances, and positioning himself to inherit her assets, then her medical crisis served his interests perfectly while providing cover for his financial manipulation. My next stop was the Jefferson County Courthouse, where public records could provide information about Roger's background and previous legal history. The clerk in the records department was helpful, directing me to computer terminals, where I could search for property transfers, court cases, and other legal documents associated with Roger's name. The search results were initially limited, but when I expanded the inquiry to include variations of his name, a disturbing pattern emerged. Roger Blackstone had previously been known as Roger Mills, a detail that immediately raised questions about why someone would change their identity unless they were trying to hide something significant. Court records showed that Roger Mills had been married twice before, and both wives had died under circumstances that resulted in substantial insurance payouts. The first wife, Patricia Mills, died in a car accident in 2018 after changing her will to designate Roger as the primary beneficiary just weeks before her death. The second wife, Linda Mills, suffered a fatal heart attack in 2021, again after recent changes to her estate planning documents that heavily favored Roger. These were not coincidences. They were evidence of a predatory pattern targeting vulnerable women, manipulating them into financial arrangements that benefited him, then profiting from their deaths, whether through natural causes, accidents, or medical emergencies. My mother was not Roger's first victim. She was simply the latest target in a carefully planned series of elder abuse and potential homicides. I printed copies of all relevant court documents and drove directly to the Denver Police Department, asking to speak with a detective who specialized in elder abuse or fraud investigations. Detective Angela Rodriguez was assigned to my case, and she listened to my concerns with the professional attention that gave me hope for the first time in days. Detective Rodriguez explained that she had actually worked on the Linda Mills case 2 years earlier, investigating the suspicious timing of estate changes and the circumstances surrounding her death. While the case had ultimately been closed due to insufficient evidence for criminal charges, she had maintained suspicions about Roger's involvement in his wife's death. The pattern you're describing matches exactly what we observed in the Mills investigation, Detective Rodriguez confirmed. Elder abuse cases often involve financial manipulation, social isolation, and rapid relationship progression designed to gain access to assets before the victim or their family can recognize the danger. She agreed to open an unofficial investigation into Roger's current activities, while cautioning that proving elder abuse or attempted homicide would require substantial evidence beyond suspicious timing and financial records. We would need to document Roger's behavior, gather witness testimony, and potentially catch him in the act of illegal activities before law enforcement could take official action. Detective Rodriguez also revealed the most chilling detail of all. Both of Roger's previous wives had experienced unexplained health problems in the weeks leading up to their deaths, symptoms that mimicked natural medical conditions, but could potentially be caused by gradual poisoning with substances that were difficult to detect in routine medical examinations. If Roger was following the same pattern with my mother, her stroke might not have been caused by our argument at all. It might have been the result of deliberate poisoning designed to incapacitate her, while he finalized his control over her assets, with plans to ensure she never recovered enough to expose his crimes. Detective Rodriguez and I developed a plan that required me to appear defeated and repentant, while secretly gathering evidence of Roger's true intentions and illegal activities. The strategy was emotionally brutal, because it meant convincing my family that I accepted full responsibility for my mother's stroke, while allowing Roger to believe his manipulation was succeeding perfectly. I recruited Lisa Chen, the hospital social worker, as a crucial ally who could observe Roger's behavior with medical staff and document any suspicious interactions regarding my mother's treatment or medication. Lisa had over 15 years of experience recognizing elder abuse patterns, and she agreed to monitor Roger's requests and behavior while maintaining professional objectivity. David Coleman. My mother's financial advisor became our third team member, agreeing to alert us about any additional attempts to access or transfer my mother's assets while she was incapacitated. David also helped us understand the legal timeline Roger was working within, since most financial institutions and insurance companies required waiting periods before processing claims related to incapacitated or deceased account holders. The plan required me to publicly apologize to my family for causing my mother's stroke through my cruel words and emotional outburst. This performance was necessary to lower Roger's guard and convince him that I was too guilt-ridden and isolated to pose any threat to his schemes. I returned to the hospital waiting room the next morning with flowers and a carefully practiced expression of remorse and defeat. Uncle Frank was reading a newspaper while Aunt Martha knitted in her chair, both of them maintaining the cold silence they had directed toward me since my mother's collapse. I approached them with visible humility, my voice breaking appropriately as I spoke. Uncle Frank, Aunt Martha, I need to apologize for the terrible things I said to Mom. You were right about everything. I was selfish and cruel, and I caused this whole tragedy through my jealousy and inability to accept her happiness with Roger. Their expression softened slightly but remained guarded as they processed this apparent transformation in my attitude. I continued with the performance that felt like swallowing broken glass. I've been thinking about what Roger said at the barbecue about building something substantial with my life, instead of just drifting through non-profit work. Maybe it's time for me to grow up and start making choices that would make Mom proud, instead of constantly disappointing her. Aunt Martha's knitting needles paused in their rhythm as she studied my face for signs of sincerity. Brady, she said carefully, we all love you, but your mother needed support for her new relationship, not criticism and suspicion. Roger has brought joy back into her life after 3 years of grief and isolation. I nodded with apparent understanding, explaining that I wanted to make amends to Roger and ask for his guidance about improving my life and career prospects. Uncle Frank seemed skeptical, but agreed to facilitate a conversation when Roger returned from his meeting with Dr. Morrison about my mother's treatment options. When Roger appeared 30 minutes later, I approached him with the demeanor of someone seeking forgiveness from a wise mentor. Roger, I said quietly, I owe you a sincere apology. I was wrong about everything. Wrong about the timeline of your relationship with Mom, wrong about your intentions, and especially wrong about the way I handled my concerns. I let jealousy and fear cloud my judgment, and I caused irreparable damage to the woman we both love. Roger's expression showed surprise, followed by satisfaction, as he realized I was surrendering to his authority over the family situation. Brady, he said with practiced magnanimity, I appreciate your honesty. Your mother loves you deeply, and she would want us to work together during this difficult time, rather than allowing conflict to make everything worse. His response was perfectly calculated to appear generous, while subtly reinforcing his position as the primary decision-maker in my mother's care. Roger suggested we step outside for a private conversation away from other family members who might be uncomfortable with emotional discussions. On the hospital's outdoor patio, Roger revealed his true nature with stunning arrogance. Brady, he said while lighting an expensive cigar, I understand why you were suspicious of me initially. Janet is a wonderful woman with significant assets, and you were naturally protective of her interests. But you need to understand that I don't need your mother's money. My real estate investments have made me independently wealthy. He pulled out his phone to show me photos of luxury properties he claimed to own across Colorado and Arizona. Multiple vacation homes, commercial real estate ventures, and investment portfolios that supposedly generated passive income exceeding most people's annual salaries. The presentation was designed to convince me that financial gain was not his motivation for pursuing my mother. What I need from Janet is companionship, intellectual stimulation, and emotional connection, Roger continued with apparent sincerity. Your father was obviously a remarkable man, and I'm not trying to replace him in her heart. I'm simply offering her a different kind of happiness for this stage of her life. His words sounded reasonable and heartfelt, but Detective Rodriguez had trained me to listen for subtle inconsistencies in his story. Roger's explanation of his wealth was suspiciously vague, lacking specific details about property locations or investment timelines that someone with genuine real estate success would naturally provide. I played my role perfectly, expressing gratitude for his patience with my suspicious behavior and asking for advice about improving my career prospects. Roger warmed to the topic, immediately suggesting that I consider transitioning from non-profit marketing to commercial real estate, where his connections could help me build a more substantial financial foundation. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Roger becoming increasingly comfortable sharing his opinions about my mother's family relationships, her financial management skills, and his plans for their future together. I wore a hidden recording device that Detective Rodriguez had provided, capturing Roger's words for later analysis. Most importantly, Roger began revealing information about my mother's medical condition and treatment that went far beyond what family members should normally discuss. He mentioned specific medications, detailed treatment timelines, and his opinions about which medical interventions offered the best chances for her recovery, versus those that might allow her condition to deteriorate naturally. His knowledge of my mother's medical situation was suspiciously comprehensive for someone who had only been in her life for 8 months. More concerning was his casual discussion of scenarios where her recovery might be limited or incomplete, almost as if he was preparing for an outcome that would serve his interests better than her full recovery. Roger also revealed that he had been researching my background extensively, gathering information about my financial situation, employment history, and personal relationships. He knew details about my apartment lease, my credit rating, and even my college transcripts that no normal boyfriend would have any reason to investigate. This surveillance suggested that Roger had been planning for multiple contingencies, including scenarios where I might become suspicious or problematic for his plans. He mentioned casually that emotional guilt could drive people to make poor decisions, sometimes even dangerous ones that could harm themselves or others. The implied threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Roger was suggesting that my guilt over causing my mother's stroke might drive me to self-destructive behavior, creating a narrative that could explain my eventual disappearance or death as suicide motivated by overwhelming remorse. As our conversation concluded, Roger invited me to visit my mother that evening, under his supervision, explaining that my presence might actually help her recovery if I approached her with genuine repentance rather than defensive anger. He also suggested that I consider making formal amends to the family by taking responsibility for the medical expenses and long-term care costs that might result from her stroke. This request confirmed Detective Rodriguez's suspicions about Roger's financial motivations. He was positioning himself to control not only my mother's assets, but also to extract additional resources from her family members through guilt and manipulation. My apparent transformation from suspicious son to repentant family member was opening doors for Roger to expand his exploitation beyond his primary victim. Walking back into the hospital, I felt sick with the knowledge of what Roger was planning while maintaining the facade of someone grateful for his forgiveness and guidance. The recording device in my pocket contained evidence of his true character, but we needed much more proof before Detective Rodriguez could take official action to protect my mother and potentially save her life. My visit to my mother's hospital room that evening was carefully orchestrated to appear like a son seeking forgiveness, while actually gathering the final evidence needed to expose Roger's crimes. Lisa Chen had arranged to be working nearby during visiting hours, positioning herself to observe and document our interactions without appearing suspicious. My mother lay unconscious, connected to monitors and IV lines that tracked her vital signs with electronic precision. The steady beeping of machines provided a rhythmic soundtrack to what would become the most important performance of my life. Roger sat in the bedside chair like a devoted partner maintaining vigil over his beloved's recovery. I approached the bed with visible emotion, taking my mother's hand and speaking as if she could hear every word. "Mom," I said with genuine tears in my voice, "I'm so sorry for the horrible things I said to you. I was wrong about Roger, wrong about your happiness, and wrong to let my fear and jealousy hurt you so badly. I would give anything to take back those words and see you recover completely." Roger watched my performance with obvious satisfaction, apparently convinced that I had been broken by guilt and family pressure into complete submission to his authority. He encouraged me to continue expressing my remorse, suggesting that my mother might be able to hear our conversation, even though she appeared unconscious. The recording device hidden in my jacket pocket captured every word as Roger began revealing his true feelings about my mother and his plans for their future. "Brady," he said while adjusting her blankets with theatrical tenderness, "Janet is stronger than you realize. She's going to recover from this stroke and live a full, happy life as my wife. We have so many plans together, so many dreams to fulfill." His confidence about her recovery was suspicious, given the severity of her condition, almost as if he knew something about her medical situation that the doctors had not shared with the family. I pressed him gently for details about her prognosis, playing the role of an anxious son, desperate for hope. Roger's response was chilling in its calculation. "The doctors say the next few days are critical," he explained while checking his expensive watch. "Her brain function could improve significantly, or she might remain in this vegetative state indefinitely. Either way, I'll be here to make sure she receives the care she needs and deserves." I asked about the medical power of attorney documents and how he had come to be designated as her healthcare decision-maker so recently. Roger's explanation was smooth and practiced, claiming that my mother had insisted on updating her legal documents after they became engaged, wanting to ensure that someone who truly loved her could make important decisions if she was ever incapacitated. She was very specific about wanting me to have that authority. Roger continued with apparent emotion. "Janet said her family loved her but didn't understand her needs the way I do. She wanted someone making medical choices who would prioritize her quality of life over just keeping her alive indefinitely." This statement was recorded clearly on my hidden device, providing evidence that Roger was already preparing justifications for potentially ending my mother's life support if her recovery threatened his inheritance plans. He was establishing a narrative that would allow him to claim he was honoring her wishes if he decided to withdraw treatment prematurely. Roger also revealed detailed knowledge about my mother's medication regimen that went beyond what a concerned partner should normally possess. He mentioned specific drug names, dosages, and interaction effects that suggested someone with either medical training or extensive research into pharmacology. Most concerning was his casual mention of medications that could affect cognitive function and decision-making capacity. I realized that Roger might have been drugging my mother for weeks or months before her stroke, using substances that would make her more compliant and susceptible to his financial manipulation, while creating symptoms that could eventually be blamed on natural medical conditions. Detective Rodriguez had instructed me to ask specific questions that might prompt Roger to reveal information about his previous marriages or his long-term plans for my mother's care. I approached these topics carefully, framing my curiosity as admiration for his devotion and experience with serious relationships. Roger became animated when discussing his philosophy about caring for seriously ill partners, explaining that he had learned important lessons from previous relationships about balancing hope with realistic expectations. He mentioned that 2 previous partners had faced serious health challenges, and he had helped them maintain dignity during their final months, rather than pursuing aggressive treatments that would only prolong suffering. His description of these relationships matched exactly what Detective Rodriguez had discovered in court records about his previous wives' deaths. Roger was essentially confessing to letting them die, rather than fighting for their recovery, framing mercy killing as compassionate care rather than financial opportunism. Most damaging was Roger's discussion of my mother's estate planning and his understanding of insurance policies and asset transfers that would take effect upon her death or permanent incapacitation. He knew specific dollar amounts, beneficiary designations, and processing timelines that demonstrated extensive preparation for inheriting her wealth. Roger also revealed his research into my family's financial situations, mentioning details about Uncle Frank's construction business, Aunt Martha's teacher's pension, and Tyler's medical practice income that he had no legitimate reason to possess. He was mapping our family's resources like a predator planning to exploit multiple victims, rather than just focusing on my mother. As visiting hours approached their end, Roger made his most incriminating statement yet. "Brady," he said, while standing to adjust my mother's IV line, "people recover from strokes at different rates, and sometimes the kindest thing is to let nature take its course, rather than forcing someone to struggle indefinitely. Your mother wouldn't want to live as a burden to her family, or exist in a diminished state that robbed her of independence and dignity." His words were spoken with apparent compassion, but the underlying message was clear. Roger was preparing to end my mother's life if her recovery interfered with his inheritance timeline, claiming that he was honoring her wishes and sparing her from suffering. I thanked Roger for his wisdom and support, maintaining my performance as the grateful son who had learned to appreciate his mother's choice in partners. As I prepared to leave, Roger suggested that I spend the next few days preparing for the possibility that my mother might not recover fully, and that the family might need to make difficult decisions about her long-term care. Walking out of the hospital, I felt the weight of what I had discovered pressing down on my chest like a physical burden. The recording device in my pocket contained evidence of Roger's intentions to kill my mother for her money, but Detective Rodriguez had warned me that audio recordings alone might not be sufficient to prevent him from carrying out his plans. We needed to catch Roger in the act of attempting to harm my mother, which meant allowing him to believe his plan was succeeding while secretly monitoring his every move. The next phase of our investigation would be the most dangerous, because if Roger suspected he was being watched, he might accelerate his timeline and try to eliminate my mother before we could gather enough evidence to stop him. The stakes could not be higher. My mother's life hung in the balance, dependent on our ability to outmaneuver a predator who had successfully killed at least 2 previous victims without facing consequences for his crimes. Time was running out, and our margin for error was essentially 0. Detective Rodriguez coordinated with hospital security and medical staff to create a surveillance network around my mother's room without alerting Roger to our investigation. Hidden cameras were installed in locations that would capture his interactions with my mother and any attempts to tamper with her medications or medical equipment. Lisa Chen arranged her work schedule to maintain frequent presence near my mother's room, documenting Roger's requests for specific medications and his conversations with medical staff about treatment options. She also monitored his behavior patterns, noting when he visited how long he stayed, and whether he followed normal protocols for family members in intensive care situations. The breakthrough came 3 days after our recorded conversation, when Roger made a request that immediately triggered Lisa's suspicions. He asked Dr. Morrison about increasing my mother's pain medication dosage, claiming that she appeared to be experiencing discomfort, even though her vital signs indicated stable condition. Dr. Morrison explained that my mother's current medication levels were appropriate for her condition, and that increasing pain medication unnecessarily could interfere with her neurological recovery. Roger persisted, suggesting that comfort should be prioritized over aggressive treatment, especially given her age and the severity of her stroke. Lisa documented this conversation and immediately contacted Detective Rodriguez, who recognized Roger's request as a potential attempt to introduce substances that could worsen my mother's condition or delay her recovery. Pain medications in excessive doses could suppress respiratory function and brain activity, creating complications that would justify ending life support. That same evening, hospital security cameras captured Roger entering my mother's room during off hours when medical staff were occupied with other patients. He spent 15 minutes alone with her, during which time he appeared to be adjusting her IV line and checking medical equipment in ways that went beyond normal visitor behavior. Most damning was footage showing Roger removing small vials from his jacket pocket and adding substances to my mother's IV bag when he believed no one was watching. The security team immediately preserved the evidence, while Detective Rodriguez obtained emergency warrants to test the IV contents and search Roger's personal belongings. Laboratory analysis revealed that Roger had been introducing medications that would slow my mother's recovery while creating symptoms that mimicked natural stroke complications. The substances included blood thinners that could cause internal bleeding sedatives that would suppress brain function and compounds that could trigger additional cardiovascular events. Armed with this evidence, Detective Rodriguez was prepared to arrest Roger for attempted murder, but I convinced her to let the situation play out long enough to catch him in a more dramatic act that would provide irrefutable proof of his intentions. We needed evidence that would convince a jury beyond any reasonable doubt, especially given Roger's previous success in avoiding conviction for his wives' deaths. The trap was set when Dr. Morrison informed Roger that my mother was showing signs of neurological improvement and might regain consciousness within the next 24 hours. Her potential recovery threatened Roger's entire plan, since an awakened Janet could expose his financial manipulation and medical interference. Roger's response to this news confirmed our worst suspicions about his intentions. He immediately began suggesting that my mother's apparent improvement might be temporary, and that family members should prepare for the possibility of difficult decisions about long-term care and quality of life issues. Roger also intensified his efforts to position himself as the loving partner who would make compassionate choices about ending my mother's suffering if her condition deteriorated. He spoke with family members about the emotional burden of watching someone they loved struggle with severe disabilities, planting seeds for accepting his decision to withdraw life support. That night, Roger returned to the hospital after visiting hours with a story about forgetting important documents in my mother's room. Hospital security allowed him access while secretly monitoring his activities through hidden cameras and recording devices. The footage captured Roger's attempted murder in horrifying detail. He removed a syringe from his jacket and prepared to inject a substance directly into my mother's IV line, an action that would have delivered a fatal dose of compounds designed to trigger massive organ failure that could be blamed on stroke complications. As Roger positioned the syringe near my mother's IV port, I burst into the room with Detective Rodriguez and hospital security close behind. Roger spun around with the syringe still in his hand, his face transforming from gentle concern to predatory rage as he realized his plan had been exposed. Detective Rodriguez drew her weapon and ordered Roger to drop the syringe, but he made one final desperate attempt to complete his murder by lunging toward my mother's IV line. I tackled him before he could reach the medical equipment, and we crashed into the bedside table while nurses rushed to secure my mother's safety. The syringe flew across the room, its contents spilling onto the hospital floor where they could be collected as evidence. Roger fought against arrest with surprising strength, screaming that my mother wanted to die with dignity rather than live as a vegetable claiming that I was forcing her to suffer for my own selfish reasons. Hospital security helped subdue Roger while Detective Rodriguez read him his rights for attempted murder, elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit homicide. The list of charges would continue growing as investigators connected his current crimes to the suspicious deaths of his previous wives. As Roger was led away in handcuffs, my family arrived to witness his arrest and learn the shocking truth about the man they had welcomed into their hearts. Uncle Frank stood speechless as Detective Rodriguez explained how Roger had been slowly poisoning my mother while manipulating her finances and isolating her from family support. Aunt Martha sobbed with horror and guilt as she realized how completely Roger had deceived them all, turning them against me, while he systematically destroyed my mother from within. Tyler and Sarah were stunned by the revelation that their criticism and blame had nearly allowed a murderer to complete his plan, without any family members recognizing the danger. The most satisfying moment came when laboratory analysis confirmed that the syringe Roger had attempted to use contained a cocktail of substances that would have caused immediate cardiac arrest, allowing him to inherit my mother's assets, while the family mourned what appeared to be a natural death from stroke complications. Justice was finally within reach, but the real victory was my mother's survival, and the possibility that she might recover enough to rebuild her life without the toxic influence of a man who had seen her only as a source of wealth, rather than a human being deserving love and protection. 6 months later, I sat in the courtroom as Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Roger Blackstone to life in prison without the possibility of parole for attempted murder in the first degree, elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy charges that had accumulated as investigators uncovered the full scope of his crimes across multiple states. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case that revealed Roger's pattern of targeting recently widowed women with substantial assets using charm and manipulation to gain access to their finances, then eliminating them when he had extracted maximum benefit from the relationships. My mother had been his fourth intended victim, saved only by our family argument that inadvertently disrupted his timeline and created opportunities for investigation. Detective Rodriguez testified about Roger's methodical approach to elder abuse, explaining how he researched potential victims through obituaries and estate notices, then approached them during vulnerable periods of grief and isolation. His tactics included rapid relationship progression, financial manipulation, social isolation, and gradual poisoning, designed to incapacitate victims while providing cover for inheritance claims. The most shocking revelation came when Patricia Mills Rogers' supposedly dead first wife appeared in court to testify against him. She had faked her own death with help from law enforcement after discovering Rogers' plans to murder her living in witness protection for 5 years, while investigators built cases against him in multiple jurisdictions. Patricia's testimony revealed Roger's true personality beneath his charming facade. He was a sociopathic predator who viewed elderly women as resources to be harvested rather than human beings deserving respect and care. His previous wife, Linda, had not been so fortunate, dying from the same gradual poisoning that Roger had attempted to use on my mother. My mother made a remarkable recovery once Roger's toxins were cleared from her system, and she received proper medical treatment. The stroke had caused some permanent damage to her left side mobility, but her cognitive function returned almost completely within 3 months. She testified at Roger's trial with strength and dignity that inspired everyone in the courtroom. Mom's testimony was particularly powerful because she could describe Roger's psychological manipulation from the victim's perspective, explaining how he had gradually isolated her from family and friends, while making her financially dependent on his approval and support. She spoke about feeling confused and anxious during their relationship, but attributing those feelings to grief rather than recognizing them as symptoms of abuse. Uncle Frank and Aunt Martha both testified about their regret for blaming me instead of investigating their concerns about Roger's rapid integration into our family. Uncle Frank actually broke down crying as he described the guilt he felt for turning against me when I was the only family member who had recognized the danger my mother was facing. The trial also revealed the extent of Roger's financial theft from my mother. He had stolen over $200,000 in cash, and investments manipulated her into changing beneficiary designations worth nearly $1 million, and fraudulently added his name to property deeds that would have given him ownership of her home upon her death. David Coleman, my mother's financial advisor, testified about Roger's sophisticated knowledge of estate planning and insurance policies, suggesting that he had either received professional training in financial fraud or had extensive experience manipulating elderly victims' assets. The prosecution used this evidence to argue for maximum sentencing due to the premeditated and predatory nature of his crimes. Lisa Chen, the hospital social worker who had helped expose Roger's medical sabotage, described his attempts to control my mother's treatment and his suspicious requests for medications that could worsen her condition. Her professional expertise in elder abuse recognition had been crucial in documenting Roger's behavior patterns and protecting my mother from additional harm. Judge Williams delivered a scathing condemnation of Roger's crimes during sentencing, describing his actions as a betrayal of trust that victimized vulnerable people during their most difficult life transitions. She emphasized that elder abuse represents one of society's most cowardly crimes because it targets people who are already struggling with loss, isolation, and declining health. The sentence of life without parole ensured that Roger would never again have the opportunity to target elderly victims, providing justice for Linda Mills's family and closure for all the people whose lives he had destroyed through his predatory behavior. Beyond the legal victory, my relationship with my mother was transformed by the crisis we had survived together. We developed new levels of honesty and communication, discussing difficult topics that we had previously avoided out of politeness or fear of conflict. Mom acknowledged that she had been vulnerable to Roger's manipulation because of her isolation and grief, while I learned to express concern in supportive rather than controlling ways. Our family dynamics were also permanently changed by the revelation that my supposedly selfish behavior had actually saved my mother's life. Uncle Frank became one of my strongest supporters, frequently telling people that I was a hero for refusing to accept Roger's manipulation when everyone else had been deceived. Aunt Martha treated me with new respect and gratitude, acknowledging that my suspicions had been based on legitimate observations rather than jealousy or selfishness. Tyler and Sarah both apologized for their role in isolating me during my mother's medical crisis, admitting that their quick acceptance of Roger's version of events had been influenced by their own assumptions about family loyalty and proper behavior. The experience taught our entire family the importance of listening to concerns, even when they challenge our preferred narratives about relationships and happiness. I channeled my experience into founding the Morrison Foundation for Elder Abuse Prevention, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families recognize warning signs of financial manipulation and providing resources for elderly people who might be vulnerable to predatory relationships. The foundation's work honored my father's memory while protecting other families from experiencing the trauma we had endured. Detective Rodriguez became the Foundation's law enforcement liaison, training police departments across Colorado to recognize elder abuse patterns and investigate suspicious relationships involving elderly victims and much younger partners who gain rapid access to their finances. Her expertise had been crucial in saving my mother's life, and she continued protecting other vulnerable people through education and prevention programs. David Coleman volunteered his financial planning expertise to help elder abuse survivors recover stolen assets and rebuild their financial security. He also worked with the foundation to educate elderly people about protecting themselves from financial manipulation while maintaining independence and dignity during their retirement years. Lisa Chen became the foundation's clinical director, developing training programs for healthcare workers to recognize signs of elder abuse and intervene appropriately when they suspected patients were being manipulated or harmed by caregivers or family members. My mother became the foundation's most effective spokesperson, traveling throughout Colorado to share her story and encourage elderly people to trust their instincts when relationships moved too quickly or partners seemed more interested in financial assets than emotional connection. Her courage in discussing her victimization helped other elderly people recognize similar patterns in their own lives. 1 year after Roger's conviction, my mother met James Patterson, a retired teacher whose wife had died from cancer 2 years earlier. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally with James, encouraging Mom's independence and friendships rather than trying to control or isolate her. Our family celebrated their engagement after 18 months of dating, confident that this relationship was based on genuine love rather than financial opportunism. The experience taught me that protecting the people we love sometimes requires challenging their decisions, even when it creates conflict and temporary estrangement. My willingness to confront my mother about Roger's suspicious behavior had ultimately saved her life, even though our argument had initially appeared to cause her medical crisis. I also learned that family loyalty means supporting each other's safety and well-being, rather than automatically accepting each other's choices without question. True love sometimes requires difficult conversations and uncomfortable challenges to prevent the people we care about from making decisions that could harm them irreparably. The Foundation's work continues helping families across Colorado recognize and respond to elder abuse, providing education support and resources for preventing financial manipulation and protecting vulnerable elderly people from predatory relationships. Every family we help represents another victory against criminals who target society's most vulnerable members for exploitation and abuse. My mother and I now have monthly dinners where we discuss foundation work, family relationships, and the lessons we learned from surviving Roger's manipulation. These conversations are honest and sometimes challenging, but they represent the kind of communication that might have prevented Roger from successfully isolating her if we had developed these skills earlier in our relationship. Standing in my apartment overlooking downtown Denver, I often reflect on how close we came to losing everything because of one man's greed and manipulation. The argument that seemed to cause my mother's stroke had actually been the catalyst for exposing a predator who might have successfully murdered her if our family conflict had not disrupted his timeline. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for family members is refuse to enable their potentially self-destructive decisions, even when our concern is unwelcome and creates temporary conflict. The courage to speak difficult truths can save lives, while the desire to avoid conflict can enable predators to complete their plans without interference. My mother's recovery and our family's healing represent victories that extend far beyond our personal experience. Every elderly person we protect through foundation programs, every family we help recognize warning signs, and every predator we help law enforcement identify and prosecute represents another life saved and another family protected from the devastation we almost experienced. The words my mother spoke in anger that terrible day have been replaced by words of gratitude and love that reflect our deeper understanding of family loyalty and protection. We learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to remain silent when someone we care about is being manipulated or harmed, even if speaking up temporarily damages our relationship. I want to ask you something important. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace in your family and protecting someone you love from a dangerous situation? How did you find the courage to speak up when everyone else thought you were wrong? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you've ever experienced something similar in your own family. If this story helped you understand the warning signs of elder abuse or gave you courage to trust your instincts about protecting vulnerable family members, please like this video and subscribe to help us reach more people who might need this information. Sharing these stories can save lives by helping families recognize dangerous patterns before it's too late. Thank you for listening to my family's story and for supporting the important work of protecting elderly people from predators who see them as opportunities rather than human beings deserving love and respect. Together, we can create communities where vulnerable people are protected and supported rather than exploited and harmed. Take care of yourselves and the people you love, and remember that sometimes the most difficult conversations are the ones that matter most for keeping our families safe and healthy.